Drawing or painting portraits is a fascinating form of art. Artists are required to capture the likeness of a person based on their subject's appearance and inner essence. There are countless artistic styles used for portraits, and in this video, I would like to explore whether realistic or stylized paintings are better. In this video, I would like to give you a brief history of where it comes from, and especially focusing on current contemporary portraits, especially digital portraits or digital paintings, and to see whether it is better to go towards a more realistic impression of a character or a person, or a bit more stylized, and to be able to define which one is a better approach. And the best way to find an answer to that question, in my opinion, is to look at some amazing artists' work and try to compare them to each other. But before we get into the analysis, I wanted to mention that the tool I'm going to use for this presentation is Milanote. If you haven't heard of it, it's a brilliant tool and they are actually sponsoring this video, but that's not the reason why I'm using it, because it's just the easiest and most convenient way to collect lots of references into one place. And it almost feels like you are using Photoshop, because even the shortcuts work, like to zoom out, zoom in, you can pan around with the space bar, but most importantly, it's a simple drag and drop from any sources, whether it's the browser on your computer, and it's collecting all the imagery and text into one place. And you can even create things like this diagram that I put together, which we will get to at the end of this tutorial. So I highly recommend for you to check it out, especially if you are into illustration or graphic design, and if you want to create mood boards or briefs, or just simply plan your workflow. So if you want to check it out, it's milanote.com/yes-I'm-a-designer, but also the link is in the description below. All the examples that I collected for this tutorial will have the names of the artists above, and you will also see some of them have their Instagram accounts added here. If you don't see the account name, that means that they are not on Instagram or I couldn't find them. So in that case, you can just search for their names and you will most likely find their work on Behance or other portfolio sites. The first two artists on my screen, Sarah Tepes and Lois van Baarle, or Lois, as most people would know her, have quite similar style, and I really love their portraits. So this is already a good example of showing that although they are based on the original proportions and facial features of people, but they are still quite stylized, and some details are exaggerated. Probably the best example would be to look at the eyes and the size of the eyes. So we can see these two images here, for example, have the eyes bigger than like what you would see normally on a face. But it's also quite cool that Lois also changes and exaggerates the position of the eyes sometimes. So here, for example, you have a huge gap between the two eyes. Normally, it would be the same distance between the two eyes as one of the eyes. So if you have the eye placed in between two of them, that's roughly the distance. And because the eyes are really big, it sort of works, but I feel like the gap is even wider than that in this case, but it still works as a stylized portrait. Now, historically, of course, portraits were more made for creating a perfect, realistic representation of a person. It was to achieve likeness and to make sure it's recognizable. But also, artists were trying to show the inner essence or characteristics of the person. And most of the time, they wanted to create a flattering representation. So something that shows the person in a positive light. Throughout art history, you can see the tendency that the artists improved their skills and they got closer and closer to photorealistic representations. But then came Impressionism, which changed everything. And since then, I would say it's completely free for you to choose whether you want to go towards more photorealistic portraits or more stylized. And especially with digital painting, which is a very forgiving medium where you can experiment and create even multiple versions or save multiple instances of the same work while you're working through it. It opens up so many avenues and ways of creating these paintings. Now, one thing is very important to mention, that having something more stylized and less realistic doesn't mean the artist is not good at anatomy or not as good as another more realistic artist. So with Sarah's work and Loish's work, we can clearly see that they have a very strong understanding of the human head and the facial features, and by exaggerating them, they are creating a more unique approach which really defines their style and makes it recognizable. So that's already something I would like you to remember from this video, that by stylizing and exaggerating some details in portraits or in any type of painting will help to define your style. And this is something you should experiment with, whether it's the colors, like with Loish sometimes uses very strange and unique colors for portraits and her paintings, or whether it's the actual proportions of the details that you are using, or even the technique or the tools or medium that you are using. It can all define the style that you will be recognizable for. So let me show you another artist, Julia Razumova, who again has a very interesting style. She is much more photorealistic, especially this one here in the middle, you can see that. But most artists, like these ones that I'm showing here, would have a range of artwork. So if you look into their portfolio or their work, you will see some of them, for example, for Julia, are very photorealistic, while others are more stylized. So they themselves also experiment with that range between the more realistic and stylized approach. But what I love about her work is that some of the paintings and portraits she does would have a very realistic detail, but then there would be these almost cartoon-like details added on top of it. Like here we can see the tears, and that is a really cool combination. Once again, that defines her style. And it is really hard to be unique, and you shouldn't be worried about being unique and like forcing something that makes your art different from others. It should be a natural evolution. So as you are experimenting and trying different things, you will eventually get to something that other people will recognize that it is your work. Now, no matter whether you are doing photorealistic or stylized portraits, one thing apart from anatomy that is very important is the understanding of light and using light in a good way that defines the form. Because you are working in 2 dimensions, but you need to represent something that is 3-dimensional. And that is very important. Like in this case, we can clearly see the highlights and the shadows and midtones used to define the form and shape of the face. So without these tonal values, it would look really flat and it would look like a cartoon. But by having the shading in place, it already looks more realistic, even though it's a stylized portrait. The lighting and shading is much more subtle when we look at an example like this one here, but still, here we can see clearly strong highlights, which makes the lips really glossy. And also these soft shadows under the neck and also around the ears that again helps to define the 3-dimensional form. For a photorealistic approach, it's good to introduce lights like this one, which is obviously much more complex and unique lighting. But again, a good understanding of how light would affect the face is very important. Now, in this case, the artist might have used a photo reference and based everything on that. But of course, some artists would just combine a couple of references together. And if they have a good understanding of how to light portraits, they would be able to do that even without an actual reference. Of course, when you're just starting out, it's a great thing to study portraits. So you can go on Pinterest and find so many amazing photos of people, and you can practice basically trying to recreate them. Instead of tracing over them, it's best to have them side by side. And don't worry too much about creating a perfect resemblance. Like even in this case, maybe the artist used a reference but then altered a couple of things. So the point is not really to create a perfect representation, especially if it's just a photo that you found online. If it's, let's say, a celebrity, then you might want to make sure that people will recognize the person in the painting. But nowadays, that's not really the only reason why you would paint a portrait. So coming back to lighting, let me just show you a very different style. So we have Alexander's work here, and this artist obviously has a more abstract approach. So it's definitely not as realistic as the ones we've seen before. It's more geometric and simplified and uses a limited color palette, but still, I think the people are recognizable. And that's a hard thing to achieve. So the more abstract you make your paintings, I would say the harder it is to achieve a likeness of the person. And of course, using geometric forms is just one of the many ways that you can achieve abstract representation of a person. You can also go to more painterly effects or paint with watercolor and inks. And you can see sometimes leaving whole parts of the portrait empty or just like have hints of details is also a cool approach. Like this artist, Yui, is using only a few details on the face that still makes it resembling the original photo in this case. So that was the original reference for this painting. But apart from those few details on the face, everything else is really rough and exaggerated. Now, we haven't talked about caricature, and I don't even have examples of that in this video, but you should treat caricature as a completely separate style, where the exaggeration is used excessively, and it's usually about taking a more fun and comical approach to a portrait. And of course, to be able to exaggerate details, first you need to learn the real proportions. Just like with anything else, the more you practice and the more you observe people and try to recreate them in paintings, the better you will get at that. But don't forget along the way to remember that a photorealistic representation, although it's interesting, it's not really the most artistic work that you can do. So if you can inject some style and exaggeration or unique details into your portraits, that will help to make it more interesting and engaging for your audience. Like Louis' work here, we can see is also very unique. It's pencil drawings, I think, colored pencil drawings, but they have amazing detail on them. And it's a mixture of the geometric style that we've seen before, but also has an amazing detail on the shading and really cool rainbow colors used on all of these portraits. Then we also have another artist with a pencil drawing where, again, we see everything in grayscale apart from a few details emphasized in color. That's also a quite nice touch and unique, makes it recognizable for the artist. But then we have these two other artists that I love, and we can see probably next to each other. In Denis's work is probably easier to appreciate if I make one of these images bigger. So it's again a very complex painting and a lot of details are added, but although it is very recognizable, so we can see immediately who it is, it still has some abstract elements in it. So it is almost like these people are made of glass and there's like shards on them. So if we look at another painting, let's just say I'm going to make this one bigger. Again, you can see the same polygons or triangles and that glossy texture on them, which makes it really cool and unique. And also these very bright and saturated colors in the background and around it that adds that painterly effect as well. So I love Denis's work. And then we have also Evgeny Parfenov's work, who again has an amazing balance between the abstract forms and the realistic resemblance of the person. Here we can see that, again, polygonal shapes are used and it's almost like a vector drawing. I'm not sure whether it was created in Illustrator or Photoshop. It doesn't really matter, but the final result feels like it's very geometric and still lifelike at the same time. So again, this is really hard to find a right balance and to work with so many different colors and still manage to achieve the shading and the lighting to work all together. This artist's work reminds me almost like stained glass. So Tyrion's portrait, for example, could be in a church window. And that's again just makes it so unique and recognizable. And last but not least, let me show you another artist, Astor, where we can see that the original reference was actually from a game, Witcher. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. So this is from the game itself, a character called Yennefer. And then the artist recreated that, or used that as a reference and recreated the same character, but in a much more painterly version. But still, this almost looks like a lifelike representation, so very realistic. And that's mainly because of the lighting that the artist was using. So having that nice backlight and then the soft light here in the front and all the little details of the hair just makes it really realistic. But again, although this artist can create these very realistic portraits, he still experiments with lots of different styles. And within that range between abstract and realistic, we can see he can create these mixtures or blend between the two sides. So we can have a realistic style combined with a much more abstract direction. So even within the same painting, as you can see, you can combine different approaches. So similarly to what we've seen before with the painterly effects, just a part of the face detailed and then the rest is just more expressive, just like with this artwork here, is also a cool and unique direction. And with my own portraits, you can see also I constantly experiment between realistic and stylized approach, but generally I try to again go for a mixture where some details are really detailed and closer to realism, while the rest of the details can be a bit more painterly and abstract. If you are interested to see how I created some of these paintings and you want to learn more about the process, you can find the links in the description below to the videos. So to summarize what we talked about today, I created a diagram and I placed some of the artwork we've seen on it. So from the complex to simple on the vertical axis, we have also realistic to abstract on the horizontal axis. You can see that whichever position you choose for your art, you will be able to achieve the goal of portraiture to create a likeness of a person. So even when you go down to the abstract and simplified route, or whether you go to the more complex and realistic one, it's completely up to you where you want to position yourself. And you can also shift and move around within this range freely and experiment with different styles. But to be able to define a recognizable style, it is good to find the right balance that works for you. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we release new videos. Click on the link on my right and start your membership today to get access to over 200 hours of training courses and personal mentoring by me and my team of creative professionals. Have fun learning, guys, and I will see you in the next one.